Let me start with an introduction of my two colleagues. Ryan Castillo, who is a partner in our capital markets group in New York, and Brad Berman, who is a counsel in the capital markets group in New York. Next slide, please. So this is the agenda of the topics we're going to try to cover today. I'm just going to do the introductory presentations on why we're going to SOFR and what SOFR is. Brad's going to talk about the ARRC and what the ARRC has, the guidance the ARRC has provided on the mechanics for using SOFR. Ryan is going to talk about the recent SEC filed SOFR offerings, and we have links for those, so they'll serve as useful examples of relatively current offerings. Brad will talk some more about term SOFR. Ryan will finish up with a discussion of the alternatives to SOFR. And with that, let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So most of you, I think, already know this, but let me just go through it quickly. Why are we adopting SOFR as a benchmark? The reason for that lies in the scandals that arose out of the financial crisis with respect to the Libor. Libor is a lending rate that came into widespread use during the 1970s, used primarily, at least initially, for offshore Eurodollar transactions. And it later became a very prominent interest rate for international transactions around the world and in multiple currencies. Libor is the London interbank offered rate. It's an interest rate average. It's calculated from estimates provided by leading banks in London of the rate at which they would lend to other banks in London in a specified currency. US dollar Libor being the most common Libor index. Libor rates today are calculated for 5 currencies and 7 borrowing periods, ranging from overnight to 1 year. But I emphasize here that these are estimates, not quotes. So these are not rates from actual lending transactions that are used as input to calculating Libor. Next slide, please. So in 2008, the Wall Street Journal released a study suggesting that banks might have understated their borrowing costs for Libor during the crisis in order to give the impression that they could borrow at lower rates than was actually the case. There was also a suggestion that in some cases Libor was manipulated in order to provide a profit opportunity for some of the banks. In 2012, subpoenas were issued to a number of banks, and an international investigation was begun. And it revealed attempts by banks, which quotes determine Libor, to manipulate the benchmark. Some of those manipulations going back as early as 2003. These investigations led to criminal convictions of individuals and some very large settlements of the banks that were providing the estimates. Next slide, please. In 2012, oversight of Libor was transferred from the British Bankers Association to the new UK Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA. In 2014, the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York formed the Alternative Reference Rates Committee, the ARRC, to assess viable alternatives to Libor. What was sought was a robust rate that was not or would not be subject to manipulation. Next slide, please. Risk-free benchmark rates have been identified as alternatives to Libor for use in various currencies. For the US dollar, the ARRC has identified SOFR, which is the Secured Overnight Funding Rate. For sterling, the Sterling Risk-Free Rates Working Group has identified SONIA, the Sterling Overnight Index Average. For the euro, the Working Group on Euro Risk-Free Rates has identified ESTER, and other jurisdictions, including Japan, Switzerland, Singapore, Canada, Australia, and others, have also identified risk-free rates for their currencies. Next slide, please. In March of this year, the FCA announced the dates for the cessation of the publication of Libor. Effective December 31st of this year, for sterling, euro, Swiss franc, and Japanese yen Libor at all tenors will cease publication, and US dollar Libor for 1 week and 2 month tenors will cease publication. Effective June 30th, 2023, Libor will cease publication for all the remaining US dollar Libor tenors. The ARRC and the US banking regulators recommend that no new obligations using Libor be entered into after December 31st of this year. After December 31st, Libor should only be used for legacy Libor obligations entered into prior to the end of the year. And even for those legacy obligations, Libor will cease to be available after June 30th, 2023. Next slide, please. As we just said, after June 30th, Libor won't be available even for legacy Libor transactions that continue to exist after that date. That leaves those legacy contracts with a number of possibilities. One, that the interest rate will be determined by fallback provisions in the contract that become effective upon cessation of the publication of Libor. Or that the fallback provisions provided by New York or federal law, and we'll talk about that more later, become effective. Or the last effective Libor rate may become the fixed rate for the contract, effectively a fixed rate for the contract. Or the interest rate may be determined under the law applicable to the contract. And I emphasize here that the law applicable to the contract is often New York, but it's not always New York. The law applying to the contract can be any of the many states in the United States or foreign jurisdictions. And finally, if none of those four possibilities exist, it is uncertain what rate applies, and it will be only resolved by negotiation between the parties to the contract. Next slide, please. And the next slide, please. So SOFR has been chosen as the replacement for US dollar Libor. The New York Federal Reserve Bank is the administrator for SOFR, and it calculates and publishes SOFR. And SOFR is an average lending rate for overnight repo transactions in US Treasury securities. The data is obtained from transaction level data collected under the supervisory authority of the Fed, and transaction level data obtained from DTC Solutions clearing data. Next slide, please. The New York Fed says on its website that SOFR provides a broad measure of the general cost of financing Treasury securities on an overnight basis. The SOFR calculation includes all trades included in the broad general collateral rate published by the Fed, plus data on transactions cleared through the fixed income clearing corporation's delivery versus payment repo service. certain repo transactions that are rating special are filtered out of that data. And what makes the SOFR rate so attractive is it comes from the overnight treasury repo market, which often or typically has a volume somewhere around $1 trillion on an overnight basis. It's considered to be the deepest financial market in the world. So the Fed publishes a SOFR rate every business day at approximately 8 a.m. But that rate is subject to revision at 2:30 in the afternoon if there's a mistake or missing data in the data used to calculate the 8 a.m. number. It's available on its website. At the same time, SOFR averages and a SOFR index, which are discussed further on, are published at the same time. If the rate is revised at 2:30 in the afternoon, it will only be done if there's a change in the rate that exceeds 1 basis point, and only on the same day as the initial publication of the rate. If the rate is revised, a footnote will indicate the revision. And updated SOFR summary statistics are published on a lag basis shortly after the end of each quarter. So from the ARRC's point of view, and I think the Fed's point of view, there are a number of advantages to SOFR. First, it's based on a very deep underlying market in actual repo transactions. It's so large, it's not considered susceptible to manipulation. From the ARRC's point of view, compound SOFR, and we'll discuss that below, approximates the cost of carrying deposit accounts. SOFR accurately reflects the cost of carrying risk-free assets like treasuries. SOFR is determined by a robust and a transparent method of determining a common benchmark rate. And finally, it's based on observable transactions rather than on estimated borrowing rates. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide. On the other hand, there are some disadvantages to SOFR, and those disadvantages are causing some sharp discussions in the market about what rates should be used for US dollar lending. From a critic's point of view, SOFR displays more volatility than Libor. There have been some occasions, particularly around quarter ends, when SOFR has had some very sharp peaks that weren't reflected in Libor. Maybe more importantly, SOFR is not credit sensitive from Libor, like Libor. Libor reflects the estimated cost of lending between banks, where SOFR is a secured rate, and a credit risk is a credit risk of US Treasuries, and in that sense, it's not credit sensitive. SOFR is not a forward-looking rate. It's the rate that was effective 2 days previously in the overnight repo market. So it's not a prospective rate like Libor, which is the rate at which banks will land over the next either overnight, 1 month, 3 months, or on an annual basis. There's a concern that SOFR may move inversely to Libor in a crisis. The concern is that in a financial crisis, Libor rates may increase, as you would expect them to, but SOFR rates may in fact tighten because it's a risk-free rate, and it's a rate that's collateralized by risk-free US Treasuries. And finally, there's a criticism that rates in the Treasury repo market can be managed by the Federal Reserve as part of its monetary policy. And in that sense, that it may not be a market-determined rate. With that, I will turn it over to Brad Berman, who's going to talk about the ARRC and the guidance that the ARRC provided us for using SOFR.
Thank you, Jerry. So who are these people? Essentially, the Federal Reserve Board, the New York Fed, they jointly convened the ARRC in 2014. It's a group of financial market participants, public and private, government, official sector entities, et cetera. And the whole point was to make sure the transition from US dollar to its risk-free replacement rate, SOFR, went well. They've got banks, asset managers, insurers, they have industry trade organizations. Next slide, please. And on their website, which by the way, if you go to the website and kind of go there's a who are we type of tab, you can actually see all the members of ARRC. The website has a lot of important information, all their statements, the various suggested contractual language for loans, securitizations, and floating rate notes that have been published. We've highlighted a couple here. Their user's guide to SOFR is very helpful. The best practices for completing transition from Libor, that was published in about April 2019. That had the fallbacks for US dollar, Libor, floating rate notes to SOFR, FAQs on best practices about the new term rate. And just even though, again, the ARRC deals with the transition in the context of loans, securitization, and floating rate notes, my presentation is going to be focused more on floating rate notes. Next slide, please. It's important to remember that they are an advisory body, not a regulatory body. They make recommendations, they're not rules. I mean, the thing to remember is, of course, two of the big members, the Board of Governors, the Federal Reserve System, and the New York Fed, members of the ARRC. So when they make a suggestion, if you are a banking entity, that's going to have a big impact on you. Eventually, it'll float down through the examiners. If you're corporate, non-banking, probably have a little more freedom to ignore, if you wish, the recommendations. They've developed guides on the use of SOFR in a number of commercial and consumer contexts, which we'll discuss. And again, the standard fallbacks for Libor, US dollar Libor, that will take effect upon the cessation of Libor. Next slide, please. And one more slide. So what's the issue with legacy Libor contracts? You can issue new Libor contracts until December 31st of this year. Hopefully, if you do so, you will include the ARRC's recommended fallback language, even though if you're a banking entity, the regulators have strongly discouraged this at this point. But there's a huge number of Libor contracts out there in both commercial and consumer contexts were created before SOFR was developed and before there were any fallback alternatives, and mainly because everybody thought Libor would go on forever. You got derivatives, residential mortgages, corporate debt. These contracts were created under the laws of a lot of different jurisdictions, including non-US ones. For example, a mortgage is going to be under the law of where the property is located. So accordingly, we kind of came to a point where we need a legislative solution. And one reason is, for example, if you have a two-party derivative contract, well, the parties can realize there's an issue and just negotiate together and come up with a solution. But when you have a corporate bond with many, many holders, that's almost impossible. And of course, holders of residential mortgages just don't have the power to really go and renegotiate their mortgages. So we're on to a legislative solution. Next slide, please. So the existing one, again, is the New York. This was signed into law on April 7th. I believe it was passed by the legislature on April 6th of this year, Article 18C of the New York General Obligations Law. And what this was designed to fix, and what Jerry mentioned before, is if you have your typical Libor floating rate note is following the old 2006 ISDA definitions. And the way that worked was you would go, if you were the calculation agent, it was, you're at the reset date for a new quarter, let's say using 3-month Libor, you flick on your Reuters screen and read it off, and that's it. Well, if you flick on your Reuters screen and there's nothing there, you were supposed to do what they call polling. So agent was supposed to poll banks in the London interbank market for 3-month loans in the same currency at about $1 million. If that didn't work, you poll banks in New York for, again, deposits. The problem with this, it was completely unrealistic, because if the administrator of LIBOR is not publishing LIBOR, a bank is not going to give a calculation or quote. There's just simply too much potential liability. What you end up is you're stuck at the last LIBOR fixing. So now you have a fixed rate note, which wasn't really envisioned when people bought the notes. So what is Article 18C doing? It's aimed at US dollar LIBOR contracts, securities or instruments. So it's a very broad net. So it picks up floaters, loans, securitization mortgages that have these 2006 ISDA definitions, or maybe they have no fallback provisions at all, and which are governed by New York law. So this is just purely a New York law solution. And it has no effect on US dollar LIBOR floaters that included the ARRC's recommended fallback provisions to SOFR, which were available starting in April 2019. No effect on non-US dollar LIBOR floating rate notes, even if they were under New York law. Next slide, please. So for US dollar LIBOR floating rate notes, by the way, there was a period when everybody realized LIBOR was going away, but before April 2019, when the ARRC came out with their fallbacks. So a lot of floaters came out with what they called a discretionary replacement fallback. Essentially, the issuer and the calculation agent in consultation would, once they determined LIBOR stopped, would pick whatever the industry standard replacement rate is, which is essentially, SOFR. So Article 18C confirms that by doing that, it's a protected action and you can't be sued. And separately, the statute has a safe harbor against liability for damages or equitable relief in connection with what they call benchmark replacement, that's replacing LIBOR with SOFR, and the implementation of what they call benchmark replacement conforming changes. And what that is essentially, if you have a LIBOR floating rate note, let's say, it's got your old 2006 ISDA definitions, what the statute does is, and actually, once there was the announcement made this March that LIBOR was ceasing, essentially the polling provisions had no effect. Practically, that really makes no difference, because by the time the actual cessation date comes up, June 30, 2023, the statute will automatically drop SOFR in. So it doesn't matter whether the polling is there or not. But essentially, there's a number of other changes the issuer and the calculation agent might have to do to make the note work. They might have to change a business day definition. They might have to work with spread adjustments, little things like that are necessary to keep the note going. Article 18C has a nice safe harbor, so they don't get sued for doing all those kinds of things. Next slide, please. The shortcomings, again, it only applies to New York law governed contracts. It's certainly not going to help for mortgages outside of New York State. There's a bigger potential issue with a conflict with the Trust Indenture Act of 1939. And you have to kind of posit this perfect storm where, let's say, the last US dollar LIBOR setting is higher than the replacement SOFR rate and the spread adjustment, which, by the way, the spread adjustment was fixed also when they announced on March 5th of this year the cessation of LIBOR. That also fixed the spread adjustments. Those are set. So we know what those are. But let's say, you have a plaintiff who bought, a legacy LIBOR note. He understands how it works. Says, okay, if there's no more LIBOR, then, great. We'll just see what the last setting is. And if it's high, I'm happy, so maybe this person could claim damages, and she could claim that Section 316B of the Trust Indenture Act was violated, and that her right to interest was impaired or affected without her consent. And state law obviously can't preempt federal law. Next slide. So to the rescue is federal LIBOR legislation, which is called the Adjustable Interest Rate LIBOR Act of 2021. That was reported to the full House of Representatives out of committee by a voice vote on July 29th of this year. I'm told that's a good sign that they only did a voice vote. This is very, very similar. It's constructed almost exactly like the New York law. So here, this would have national effect. It specifically amends Section 316B of the Trust Indenture Act to resolve that potential issue. It has a similar safe harbor against lawsuits, and once it passes, Article 18C will actually be preempted. Next slide. And there's a lot of groups who have an interest in the legislation. I know here we've gotten calls from issuers, from trustees, all kinds of groups, because there's this uncertainty about these LIBOR notes, and people don't want to get sued, and what's going to happen. So there's a lot of groups. Interestingly, in the federal statute, some of the consumer groups are concerned with that safe harbor about the making adjustments, the benchmark conforming changes. So there's a little back and forth going on about that. We'll just have to see how that shakes out. Next slide, please. And one more. Thanks. So, all right, so how do we use SOFR? There's a number of different ways of use SOFR, and the ARRC has published a lot of handy tools to simplify the calculations. There's simple SOFR, that's just SOFR for that day. There's average SOFR. There's SOFR averages, which are different from average SOFR. There's compounded SOFR. There's the SOFR Index, and now we have term SOFR. And the issue with all of this is that they have to, you need, and I'll just jump ahead of myself a little bit, but when you had your typical LIBOR floating rate note, let's say you had a 3-month LIBOR note. Well, when it came time for an interest reset date, the first date of a new interest period, you would read LIBOR off the screen. It was forward looking. So if that was, for example, January 1st, you would know on January 1st what the interest payment would be on March 31st, because the rate didn't change. It's forward looking and nice and easy, really nothing to figure out. It was just the rate was on the screen. That was the end of it. What we have now with these various, essentially they have cobbled together out of the daily rate ways to get a term rate, and it's in arrears because SOFR is backward looking. I'm going to hold off on my discussion of term SOFR. I'll be coming back to that later after Ryan's piece, which one would hope would solve the problem. But so they've come out with these things called payment delay, look back, and observation shift. And the ARRC has published term sheets. Next slide, please.
Brad, if I could just interject for a second. Melissa wants us to mention that there are a lot of people on the phone who don't have a video link. And we're going to be circulating the slides via email, and we're going to be posting them on the event page of our website shortly. Sorry for that.
Okay, good. Well, we worked hard on these slides, so I think they'll be helpful. So as I mentioned, you're trying to take a daily rate and turn it into a term rate as opposed to a forward-looking rate like LIBOR. By the way, and you'll see when Ryan gives his examples, I'm going to go through how these term sheets work, but he has specific slides that show different issuers using this. One thing to remember, it's kind of interesting if you're drafting a SOFR provision, there's no interest reset dates for SOFR. Like I mentioned in LIBOR, the rate resets, it's forward looking, but in SOFR, it's because it's in arrears, there's nothing to reset. So if you ever see someone talking about a SOFR interest reset date, that doesn't really work. Okay. And as Jerry mentioned earlier, really more specifically, the problem is that on the morning that an interest payment's to be calculated, let's say it's Friday is the interest payment date. Okay, the latest available SOFR rate, the rate was published in final at mid-afternoon on the preceding U.S. government securities business day. That was Thursday. And that rate's for really what was loaned on Wednesday night. So you have this built-in 2 U.S. government securities business days lag with SOFR. Next slide, please. So therefore, if you're compounding SOFR over the period, you get to the final rate and the payment amount, you're not really going to know it until 2 U.S. government securities business days after the end of the period. So how do we solve for that? Next slide, please. So the model, there's actually there's a total of 4 model term sheets. For compounded SOFR floaters, they've each dealt with the lack of notice of the interest amount at the end of the interest period in different ways. So first is look back. Essentially that says any particular day in the period, the SOFR reading is going to be X number of U.S. government securities business days before the date of determination. So for example, let's assume a 5 U.S. government securities business day look back. If the interest payment date was Friday, interest accruing through Thursday, you got the 5-day look back. Really, you would have known now for a whole week, the previous Thursday, what the interest payment will be. So that builds in a period when people have time to calculate and pay. Next slide. So observation period shift. This is kind of an interesting one. There's your typical interest period from and including an interest payment date to, but excluding the next one. But within that is this observation period that's shifted back a certain number of days, and that's where you're measuring the interest. So if you shift it back 2 or 3 U.S. government securities business days, you've got some time to calculate and make the payment. So if the interest payment date were to be on a Friday, if the observation period from and including the Wednesday prior to the previous interest payment date to, but excluding the Wednesday prior to the relevant one, you've got a 2 U.S. government business day shift, so you got some extra notice. Next slide, please. And payment delay just sounds exactly what it is, and this really reflects, like what we mentioned before, that there's this 2-day lag. You get paid 2 business days after the interest payment date, except at maturity or early redemption. So you have your normal interest periods. If your interest period ends on a Friday, holders are going to be paid on the following Tuesday, except prior to maturity and redemption, they use a rate cutoff date or lockout a certain number of U.S. government securities business days prior to the maturity or redemption date. The rate locks in and applies for the last couple of days. So on the first day of that lock-in period prior to maturity, they can calculate the rate, and therefore you won't have a late payment on maturity or redemption. Next slide. And the ARRC's published, the 4th one was the SOFR Index, and that measures SOFR compounded since April 2, 2018. That was the first date. Here, the compounding is built right into the index, so you don't have these nasty compounding formulas that investors look at and don't know what they're talking about. You do your interest rate by comparing the SOFR index level at the start and end dates of the interest period. You should floor the rate at 0, even though negative SOFR is very unlikely. Next slide, please. The sample term sheet uses the observation period shift method, and SOFR index is published on its value date. The ARRC also, the Fed also publishes SOFR averages, 30, 90, and 100-day compounded SOFR average SOFR values. They look back those periods, they sweep in all the days, weekends or holidays included, give you a number. They're published on their value date. Next slide, please.
So in the next few slides, we show a number of floating rate note deals from the past year and a half that used SOFR as their reference rate for determining interest. So these are SEC registered SOFR deals. And issuers have utilized SOFR in their deals using the values, conventions, and mechanics that Brad talked about. So in this slide, beginning on slide 38 shows a few examples of SOFR deals that utilize compound SOFR with the look-back convention. So we see BMO issuing fixed to floating rate notes in October of last year, and RBC issued 2 tranches of fixed to floating rate notes in February and May of last year. Both issuers used a 5-day look-back period here. And as Jerry mentioned before, we've included Edgar links to the offering and pricing materials from these issuances and the other deals in this section entitled Recent SOFR Offerings for your easy reference. So in this compound SOFR with look-back deals that we mentioned, as well as other compound deals using the look-back convention, we generally see in the description of notes in the offering documents the following disclosure in this slide related to the computation of SOFR. And this, by the way, is taken from ARRC's November 2019 appendix to the SOFR FRN conventions matrix. So on slide 39, we see in the blue text of the formula SOFR subscript I minus 5 USBD. This means that for any US government securities business day I in the relevant interest period, we should refer to the daily SOFR rate on the date falling 5 USGS business days prior to that day I. So you look back. Hence, there is a look back period here of 5 days. Now, the next slide, slide 40, shows recent examples of SOFR deals that utilized compound SOFR with an observation period shift convention. So you see that from March to June of this year, we see issuances of floating rate notes for fixed rate notes, of floating rate notes or fixed to floating rate notes from big banks like JPM, HSBC, Goldman Sachs, and TD. And again, the links, the Edgar links are embedded in those in the description here. So in these deals, as well as other compound SOFR deals using the observation period shift convention, we generally see in the description of notes the following disclosure related to the SOFR computation, as you will see on this slide 41. This again is taken from the ARRC's November 2019 appendix to the conventions matrix. So here we see in the formula SOFR subscript I, and that means that for any US government securities business day I in the relevant observation period, we should refer to the daily SOFR rate in that day I in the observation period. So we'll notice here that the concept of an observation period is introduced, and that term is defined as the period from a date preceding here 2 USGS business days before the first day of the interest period to the date 2 USGS business days before the first interest payment date for such interest period. So in effect, the interest period is shifted back a certain number of USGS business days prior to the relevant interest payment date. Hence, there is what you call an observation period shift. And you'll know the interest amount in this example due 2 days before the interest payment date. Now, the next slide shows examples of SOFR deals that utilized compound SOFR with a payment delay convention. So from March to April of this year, we see issues from Bank of America floating rate notes or fixed to floating rate notes. And here they used a 2-day payment delay feature. That is, interest is paid on the second business day following the interest accrual period. So to elaborate on these compound SOFR deals that utilize the payment delay convention, we generally see in the description of notes the following disclosure related to the SOFR computation, as you can see in slide 43. So here we see the formula SOFR subscript I, and that means that for any US government securities business day I in the relevant interest accrual period, we should simply refer to the daily SOFR rate on that day I. But you have a definition there of an interest payment date. The interest payment date for use for a payment delay convention is delayed. That is, the issuer will pay here on the second business day following each interest accrual period end date. And the concept of an interest accrual period is introduced, and that term is defined as the period from the prior interest accrual period end date to the next interest accrual period end date, which again here is the 2 days prior to the interest payment date. Now the next slide, slide 44, shows recent examples of SOFR deals that utilized compound SOFR using the SOFR Index with an observation period shift convention. So we see that from March to April of this year, we have issuances of floating rate notes from AT&T, Schwab, Verizon, and Pony. In these deals, as well as other compound SOFR deals using the SOFR Index on slide 45, we generally see the following disclosure related to the SOFR computation. And this is taken from ARRC's May 2020 statement on the use of the SOFR Index. Here we see that the observation period concept applies again, but in the formula, you have the concepts of SOFR Index subscript start and SOFR Index end. SOFR Index start refers to the SOFR Index value for the day here, 2 USGS business days before the issuance of the notes or before the first day of the relevant interest period. Then SOFR Index end is the SOFR Index value for the day here, 2 USGS business days before the interest payment date for such interest period. So those are examples of recent SEC registered SOFR offerings. Let me turn it over now to Brad to talk about term SOFR.
Thank you, Ryan. So term SOFR, that's the recent forward-looking SOFR rate that functions similar to Libor. It's developed based on actual SOFR future transactions. We've waited a long time for this. The ARRC had published requirements that needed to be met before it would recommend a term SOFR. We have the link there. Next slide, please. And they've also published recommended best practices for how to use it in their FAQs. It's interesting because, by the way, the ARRC sort of, they say we support things mainly. They're a little coy about a number of things, but what they support the use of term SOFR for the business loan market. So multi-lender facilities, middle market loans, trade finance loans, certain securitizations. They do not support the use of term SOFR for most derivative transactions. They're saying it should be used only for end user facing derivatives intended to hedge cash products that reference term SOFR. Next slide, please. Now, they recommended the use of CME's term SOFR rate on July 29th of this year. As I mentioned, they published best practices. Now, what about floating rate notes? Now, when you start going into their materials, what they've said is they support term SOFR and the replacement fallback waterfall for existing US dollar Libor floaters. So, for example, if you've published a US dollar Libor note, you use their April 2019 recommended fallback provisions. The first SOFR choice in that fallback was term SOFR, so they're saying we support that. They also support it as the first SOFR rate that would be recommended by the ARRC under Article 18C of the New York General Obligations Law. So, for example, when you go in that law, and the same thing with the federal, they talk about a governing body or a commission of a governing body recommending a replacement rate. So they will say that okay, term SOFR is the first one. Now, for new floating rate notes, fresh issuances, the ARRC recommends overnight SOFR and SOFR averages. Next slide, please. So I guess one of the questions is, a forward-looking term rate would be really handy for SOFR instead of trying to cobble together a rate that we have to use in arrears, all these complex formulas that we're doing now with the various in the SOFR index with the 4 possibilities that me and Ryan went over. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just do what we used to do with Libor, which was choose a rate at the beginning of the period and sit back and wait 3 months and then pay, and you'll know what that payments will be 3 months hence. So that would act just like Libor and clear up a lot of the complexity, but the ARRC is being pretty quiet about that. What they did say after they mentioned that they supported for floating rate notes using average or compounded SOFR as is being used now, they said that the limitation on use is intended to avoid use that's not in proportion to or materially detracts from the depth of the transactions in the underlying derivatives market that are essential to the construction of term SOFR over time. So it kind of sounds like they're worried about if we start doing all these floating rate notes on SOFR, somehow it'll cannibalize the the rate itself. One thing I think is important to mention is, again, the ARRCs, these are recommendations, they're not rules. The other thing is that, the ARRCs, two of their prime members are the New York Fed and the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. So if you are a banking entity, it would probably be a good idea to follow this. But if you were a corporate, for example, you're not, it has less impact on you. And maybe we'll see some corporates doing fresh issuances of term SOFR floating rate notes, but we'll see what the market does. And now I will hand it back to, I believe, Ryan on alternatives to SOFR.
Thanks, Brad. So now let's talk about alternatives to SOFR that have become quite a hot topic of interest and has attracted a regulatory and media attention of late. On slide 52, there continues to be an appetite for market participants, including lenders, borrowers, and index providers for a credit-sensitive rate a la Libor. And participants are seeking an alternative rate that reflects the unsecured cost of funding for banks, particularly a rate applied in interbank lending that reflects the credit risk of interbank loans. So what we're seeing is that some participants complain that SOFR lacks a credit risk component. That is, SOFR is a secured, risk-free rate, not an unsecured cost of funds rate like Libor. Even SONIA, the replacement for Libor in the UK, is a rate based on overnight interbank lending, while SOFR is not. In fact, shortly after the ARRC recommended SOFR as its Libor replacement choice, a number of regional and small banks complained that SOFR was not suitable for them because, one, as a secured overnight rate, it would behave differently than a term unsecured rate in distressed markets. And two, SOFR was a poor proxy for their cost of funds since they do not have material treasury portfolios and do not fund in the overnight repo markets. So what we're seeing is that market participants are seeking a SOFR alternative that retains some of the advantages that Libor provides. And in this regard, in the next slide, we see that a number of organizations and index providers have proposed alternative so-called credit-sensitive rates, or CSRs. For example, the American Financial Exchange, or AFX, has proposed a Maribor. AFX is an electronic exchange for direct lending and borrowing for American banks and financial institutions. A Maribor is an interest rate benchmark created by AFX and reflects the actual unsecured borrowing costs of over 1,000 American banks and financial institutions. And the Maribor is calculated as a transaction volume weighted average interest rate of the daily transactions in the Maribor overnight unsecured loan market on the AFX. And some regional banks are reported to be advocating for a Maribor. Next, we have BSBY. So Bloomberg Finance has created the Bloomberg Short-Term Bank Yield Index, or BSBY. According to Bloomberg, BSBY aims to measure the average yields at which investors are willing to invest USD funds on a senior unsecured basis in the list of large and super regional banks at various tenors. BSBY is based on a consolidated anonymized transaction-related data and firm executable quotes of commercial paper, certificates of deposits, and deposits from Bloomberg Electronic Trading Solutions, and trades of senior unsecured bank corporate bonds as reported in TRACE. So transactions are not submitted by banks. Rather, Bloomberg uses market data available as part of its electronic trading services and TRACE data. Currently, BSBY uses data from about 34 eligible banks compared to Libor, which has 16 banks in its span. On the next slide, we see also a few additional credit-sensitive rates, beginning with the ICE Bank Yield Index, which was created by the Intercontinental Exchange, or ICE. ICE describes the ICE Bank Yield Index as a forward-looking credit-sensitive benchmark developed for US dollar lending activity. The index will be based on unsecured transactions in the obligations of banks and will use two types of fully transactional input data representing wholesale unsecured bank investment yields, namely primary market funding transactions and secondary market bond transactions. And last, you have another example. IHS Market Benchmark Administration, or IHS Market, developed the USD Credit Inclusive Term Rate, or CRITR, and the USD Credit Inclusive Term Spread, or CRITS, that track USD institutional CDs and commercial paper. And again, we have included links to these credit-sensitive rates for your easy reference. Now, the proposal to use credit-sensitive rates as SOFR alternatives has been met with regulatory scrutiny and criticism recently. At a June 11 meeting of the Financial Stability Oversight Council, or FSOC, U.S. regulators spoke out against the use of credit-sensitive benchmarks in derivatives contracts. SEC Chair Gary Gensler said pointedly that Bloomberg's BSBY suffered from many of the same flaws as Libor, including the same inverted pyramid problem as Libor. And in the next few slides, we've compiled some of the statements and concerns expressed by the regulators with respect to the adoptions of these CSRs. But in essence, there is concern among regulators that the proposed rates are not supported by deep markets in actual transactions. There is concern that the extensive use of the alternative credit-sensitive rates will simply recreate many of the vulnerabilities that we had in Libor. For instance, on the next slide, SEC Chair Gensler stated that BSBY has many of the same flaws as Libor. He compared Libor to BSBY in that both are inverted pyramids, in that a small amount of measurable data underpins a large number of transactions, compared to SOFR, which is based on nearly $1 trillion market of transactions per day. So according to Chair Gensler, this mismatch is an incentive for manipulation. He stated that the markets underpinning BSBY not only are thin in good times, they virtually disappear in a crisis. On the next slide, we see also some statement from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who expressed a similar concern and said that the volume of derivatives contracts referencing these alternative rates could quickly outnumber the transaction volumes underlying the reference rate, leaving it vulnerable to manipulation and disruption, one of the primary issues with Libor. The FHFA, the next slide please, which regulates Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the Federal Home Loan Banks, issued a supervisory letter to Federal Home Loan Banks in July this year. It said that the adoption of these alternative rates may significantly pose the same safety and soundness and reputational risks that befell Libor. And that unfortunately, most, if not all, of these credit-sensitive rates suffer from the same underlying shortcomings as Libor, namely a relatively small number of actual unsecured lending transactions on which to base a rate and sensitivity to market stress that can destabilize a smooth functioning market and overall economic conditions. And here, FHFA then required Federal Home Loan Banks to provide notice to their examiners before making any loans tied to any reference rate other than SOFR. Similarly, on the next slide, just last Wednesday, the International Organization of Securities Commissions, or IOSCO, issued a statement on credit-sensitive rates saying that the widespread use and transition to credit-sensitive rates instead of the US ARRC's preferred secured overnight financing rate may pose risks to financial stability, and that the IOSCO board notes that SOFR provides a robust rate suitable for use in most products with underlying transaction volumes that are unmatched by other alternatives. So that's what we're seeing right now with respect to these credit-sensitive rates. Let me hand it over now to Jerry.
Thanks, Ryan. I note that we haven't had any questions come in. Maybe I just mentioned in the next few minutes, if anybody has any questions, please submit them to the chat window and we'll try to address them. Just as a summary, I'd like to say that obviously we're in September. We don't have very much time between now and the end of the year and the cessation of the publication of Libor. And lenders have a tremendous amount of work to do to be prepared to deal with the cessation of Libor. They've got to change IT systems. They have to develop forms. They have to provide training for loan officers. There's a great deal of work that has to be done to support new rates. Most of that work has been underway for some time. So to some extent, that work will already have chosen the rates that banks think they're going to use after the cessation of Libor. The next few months is going to tell us a lot about what happens in the transition from Libor. So I just point you to some additional resources here. These are all on the left-hand side links to publications from ARRC. On the right-hand side, an IBOR transition digest, which is a website on the Mayor Brown website. And on the last page, 565, I think, an I on IBOR transition and free writing perspectives, two blogs that Mayor Brown provides that will give you some additional information on SOFR and on the transition from Libor. With that, I don't see any questions coming up on our chat box. So I will thank you very much for attending, and that will conclude our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.